Escaping a werewolf pack requires blood, death, or high treason. Fallon chooses treason. She is sick of the freezing woods. She is sick of the strict rules. Most of all, she is sick of Alpha Callahan and his unbending control. She wants her freedom, and she is willing to start a supernatural war to get it. Her exit strategy requires a sewing needle, red ink, and the name of a local vampire lord. If she can convince the pack elders a monster claimed her, they will cast her out on the spot. It is a brilliant, flawless lie, but she forgets one crucial detail. The Alpha hears every single whisper, and he refuses to let what is his walk away. The stage is set. The ink is drying. Chapter 1. Fallon leaned against the rough stone wall of the corridor. She held up a small, cracked pocket mirror. She turned her neck to the side. The fake bite mark looked flawless. She had spent 10 minutes poking her skin with a sewing needle. Then she rubbed red pen ink into the scratches. It stung, but it looked just like a fresh vampire bite. Nailed it, Fallon muttered to the empty hall. Time to get fired. She shoved the mirror into her front pocket. She walked to the thick wooden doors of the pack hall. She pushed them open with both hands. The iron hinges shrieked. The Adler Pack elders sat in a wide circle around a stone fire pit. The flames popped, sending orange sparks into the air. Elder Thomas, Elder Henry, and Elder Arthur sat in high-backed chairs. They wore dark sweaters and stern expressions. At the far end of the room sat Alpha Callahan. Callahan did not look like an old politician. He looked like a weapon left on a table. He sat slumped in his seat, his boots propped on the lower rung of the wooden chair. He wore a gray t-shirt and dark jeans. He stared at the fire. Fallon walked straight to the center of the rug. She put her hands on her hips. "Fallon," Thomas said. He rubbed his wrinkled forehead. "You demanded an emergency meeting. Speak." "I am done," Fallon said. "I want my name removed from the Adler Pack registry. Today." The elders frowned. Arthur leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "You cannot just quit the pack. You are an Adler. You run the border patrols. You follow the Alpha." "I walk the borders in the freezing rain for 0 pay," Fallon countered. "I eat bad deer meat on Tuesdays. I have no life. I want out." "Refused," Henry snapped. "Pack law binds you to this territory until the day you take your last breath. Stop acting like a spoiled child and get back to your duties." Fallon smiled. It was not a nice smile. "Pack law also says I belong to this territory unless another supernatural leader stakes a claim, correct?" Thomas went rigid. "What are you talking about?" Callahan lifted his head. His eyes met hers. They were bright, piercing amber. The gaze hit her like a bucket of ice water down her spine. She ignored the shiver and kept her chin high. Fallon reached up and pulled the collar of her shirt down. She exposed the side of her neck. The red, bruised punctures sat clear on her pale skin for everyone to see. "Saurin of the Croft Coven," Fallon announced. She let her voice bounce off the high ceilings. "He claimed me last night. I belong to the vampire lord now. You have to let me go." The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire pit. Thomas grabbed the arms of his chair. His face went white. "A bloodsucker," the old man breathed. "You let a leech put his teeth in you?" "Sure did," Fallon lied. She let go of her collar. "So, grab the registry book and cross out my name. Have a nice life, gentlemen." She turned her back on the elders. She started walking back toward the heavy doors. Her boots clicked on the stone floor. She looked down at the ground and muttered to herself. "Nailed it. Time to pack my bags. Hello, freedom." She thought the elders were making too much noise to hear her. She thought she had won. She was wrong. Callahan had super hearing. The muttered words hit his ears clear and sharp. "Fake." A dark, rumbling voice roared inside Callahan's skull. "She lies to us. She is ours. Mate." Callahan gripped the armrests of his chair. The thick wood cracked under his fingers. He closed his eyes and fought the beast. The wolf wanted to tear the room apart. It wanted to tackle Fallon to the rug and mark her for real. "Shut up and sit down," Callahan told the animal in his head. He rubbed his temple, fighting a sudden pounding headache. He opened his eyes. He watched Fallon reach for the brass door handle. She actually thought she could trick him and walk away. Callahan stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped backward across the stone floor. The harsh noise made all three elders flinch. "Alpha," Thomas warned. "If the vampire lord marked her, she is outside our protection. We cannot risk a war over one runaway." Callahan ignored the old man. He stepped down from the raised platform. He crossed the long room in 3 fast strides. He did not say a single word. Fallon grabbed the brass handle. She pulled the door open an inch. Before she could step through, a large, warm hand clamped down hard on her elbow. Fallon froze. The grip on her arm felt like a steel trap. The heat rolling off Callahan's body warmed the cold air in the doorway. She turned her head. Callahan stared down at her. His jaw was locked tight. The feral heat in his stare swirled with rising anger. She knew right then that her clever plan had just hit a brick wall. Chapter 2. Fallon yanked her arm. She tried to pull away from the Alpha. It was like trying to pull her arm out of a locked vault. Callahan did not let go. "Hey!" Fallon yelped. She stumbled backward as he pulled her away from the door. "You know, personal space is a real thing. Let go of me." Callahan kept his grip on her elbow and marched her right out of the pack hall. He kicked the heavy oak doors open with one boot. They hit the stone walls with a loud crash. "Mate," the giant wolf in Callahan's head snarled, "drop her to the dirt, bite her neck, show them she belongs to us." Callahan ground his teeth together. "Quiet," he ordered the beast. "I am not biting a liar in the middle of the courtyard." He dragged Fallon down the front steps of the pack house. The cool evening air hit them. The sky was turning dark gray, and a harsh wind blew through the tall pine trees. The Adler Pack grounds stretched out in front of them, a mix of dirt roads and wooden cabins. Fallon scrambled to keep up with his long strides. Her boots slipped in the loose dirt. "Where are we going?" Fallon complained out loud. "Do you ever slow down? My legs are shorter than yours. You walk like a runaway train." Callahan stared straight ahead. He pulled her down the path that led away from the main camp. They walked past the training rings and the meat smokehouses. Several pack members stopped and stared at them. Callahan shot them a glare that sent them running back to their chores. "This is kidnapping," Fallon grunted. She kicked a loose rock on the path. "I just told your bosses I belong to a vampire. You cannot drag me around like a stray dog. I have rights." Callahan ignored her. The headache in his skull pulsed behind his eyes. The wolf paced in its mental cage, furious and possessive. The beast wanted to rip the fake scent of red ink right off her skin. They reached the edge of the woods. The path turned narrow and dark. Tree roots stuck out of the ground like twisted fingers. "I hate the woods," Fallon said to the trees. She tripped over a root and caught her balance. "I hate dirt. I hate walking. You are ruining my favorite boots." Callahan's ear twitched. He heard every sarcastic word, every grunt, every sigh. It grated on his nerves, but it also amused the wolf. The beast liked her fire. "She is strong," the wolf purred. "Keep her." "She is a headache," Callahan argued back. "Are you deaf?" Fallon asked, raising her voice. She pulled back hard, but his grip held firm. "I said, where are you taking me? If you kill me out here, someone will find the body. I left a note." "You did not leave a note," Callahan said. His voice was a low, rough rumble. It was the first time he had spoken since grabbing her. Fallon blinked in surprise. "Okay, fine. I did not leave a note, but I will haunt you." Callahan kept walking. The dirt path gave way to old, cracked cobblestones. The trees parted, revealing the old, supernatural boundary line. Beyond the trees sat the Croft Coven graveyard. It was a bleak, silent place filled with crumbling headstones and dead grass. "Oh no," Fallon said. Her voice lost its sarcastic edge for a second. "We are not going in there. We are not allowed in there." Callahan marched right past the rusty iron gates. He dragged her down the center path of the graveyard. The wind howled around the stone monuments. "Callahan, stop!" Fallon said. She dug her heels into the dirt. "This is vampire territory. If they catch us, they will start a war." Callahan did not stop. He steered her toward the largest structure in the graveyard. It was a square stone crypt built into the side of a small hill. Heavy iron bars sat over the small windows. A thick stone door sealed the entrance. "You called his name," Callahan said, his voice hard. "Now we go see him." Fallon stared at the dark crypt. Panic flared in her chest. She had never actually met Saurin. She just picked his name because he was the local vampire boss. She expected the elders to banish her on the spot. She never expected the Alpha to call her bluff. "Listen," Fallon muttered out loud. "Maybe we can just go back. I will do the Tuesday border patrols. I will eat the bad meat." Callahan let go of her arm. He stepped up to the crypt. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles. "Too late," Callahan said. Chapter 3. Callahan stood in front of the stone door. The Croft Coven crypt looked like a small fortress. The stone was gray, damp, and covered in thick green moss. There was no handle, no keyhole, and no obvious way to get inside. Fallon crossed her arms over her chest. She rubbed her elbows, trying to stay warm. "See?" Fallon said out loud. "It is locked shut. Nobody is home. We should leave before a bunch of bloodsuckers show up and drain us." Callahan did not turn around. He lifted his right boot and kicked the center of the stone door. The impact sounded like a bomb going off. The thick stone shattered inward. Huge chunks of rock flew into the dark room. A cloud of gray dust exploded out of the doorway. The door broke into jagged, ruined pieces and crashed onto the floor inside. Fallon jumped back, covering her face with her arms. "Are you out of your mind?" she yelled over the noise. Callahan stepped over the broken rubble. He walked right into the crypt. The door was gone. The cold night air poured into the dark room, and there was no way to shut it out. Fallon coughed, waving the dust away. She followed him inside, stepping carefully over the ruined stone chunks. The inside of the crypt was strange. It did not look like a dusty tomb. It looked like a luxury apartment ruined by a rock slide. A plush red rug covered the floor. A small wooden side table held a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. In the very center of the room sat a plain, unpainted pine coffin. The dust settled. The room fell quiet. Then, the lid of the pine coffin slid to the side. Saurin sat up. He wore dark blue silk pajamas with matching white piping. He had a blue silk sleep mask pulled down over his eyes. He reached up, grabbed the edge of the mask, and pulled it up to rest on his forehead. Saurin looked at the ruined stone door. Then he looked at Callahan. He did not look scared. He looked deeply annoyed. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" Saurin asked. His voice was smooth and calm. "The sun went down an hour ago. I was just hitting my deep sleep cycle." Callahan marched up to the pine box. He grabbed the edge of the coffin lid with both hands. He yanked hard. The metal hinges tore out of the wood with a loud screech. Callahan lifted the heavy lid over his head and snapped the solid wood right down the middle over his knee. He threw the broken wooden halves onto the floor. They clattered against the stone rubble. "Get out of the box," Callahan demanded. Saurin sighed. He looked down at the splintered wood on the floor. He ran a hand through his dark hair. "That box cost me $3,000 in cash," Saurin said, shaking his head. "I had to do a terrible favor for a local witch to get the warding runes carved on the bottom. You lack basic manners, Alpha." Fallon stood near the doorway. She watched the vampire complain about the wood. She leaned against the wall and whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear. "He has a point. That was totally uncalled for. The door was bad enough." Callahan whipped his head around. He glared at Fallon. His amber eyes burned in the dim light of the crypt. "Silence her," the wolf snarled in his head. "Show the leech she belongs to the pack." "I am trying to run an interrogation," Callahan argued with the beast. "Stop trying to bite everyone." Saurin placed his hands on the sides of the coffin and lifted himself out. He stood barefoot on the red rug. He did not look like a terrifying monster. He looked like a rich guy whose vacation just got ruined. "So," Saurin said. He walked over to the side table and picked up the crystal decanter. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a werewolf home invasion? Are we starting a turf war on a Tuesday? I really prefer to schedule my wars for the weekend." "She says you claimed her," Callahan grunted. He pointed a thick finger at Fallon. Saurin paused. He held the decanter in one hand and a glass in the other. He turned his head and looked at Fallon. He took in her messy hair, her muddy boots, and the tense way she stood against the wall. Then his eyes locked onto her neck. He stared at the red marks on her skin for a long moment. Fallon swallowed hard. She waited for the vampire to scream, attack, or call her a liar. She braced herself for a fight. Saurin blinked. He poured a small amount of dark red liquid into the glass. "Well," Saurin said, "this just got very interesting." Chapter 4. Saurin took a slow sip from his crystal glass. The dark red liquid coated the sides of the cup. He swallowed, closed his eyes, and let out a relaxed breath. "A sharp pen and cheap red ink," Saurin said, opening his eyes. He looked right at Fallon. "A very creative attempt, little wolf, but real vampire bites do not smear when you sweat." Fallon reached up and touched her neck. Her fingers came away with a faint smudge of red. She wiped her hand on her jeans and scowled. "It was a solid plan," Fallon muttered out loud. "It just needed better art supplies." Callahan crossed his arms. His biceps strained against the thin fabric. He stared at the vampire. "She made a public declaration in front of the Adler elders. She invoked your name. By our laws, the claim stands until it is broken." Saurin walked over to a velvet armchair in the corner of the room. He sat down, crossing one silk-clad leg over the other. He swirled the red liquid in his glass. "Ah, yes, the ancient pack laws," Saurin said, sounding bored. "A rigid system designed to cause headaches. If another leader claims a wolf, the Alpha must either start a bloody war to get her back or pay a buyout price. A simple trade." Saurin took another sip. "I hate wars. They are loud, messy, and ruin my favorite suits. So, I will propose a trade." Callahan narrowed his eyes. "What do you want? Cash? Territory?" "Rip his head off. Take her home," the wolf demanded in Callahan's mind. "Wait," Callahan told the beast. "Let him talk." Saurin laughed softly. "I do not want your dirty money or your muddy woods. I have a pest problem. A gang of rogue vampires set up camp on the edge of town. They have no class, no style, and terrible hygiene." Saurin set his glass down on the wooden side table. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "These rogues keep hijacking my supply trucks," Saurin continued. "They stole 5 crates of my private reserve cherry-infused blood wine. It is a very rare vintage. I am quite upset about it." Fallon stared at him from the doorway. She dropped her arms to her sides. "Wait," Fallon said. "You want us to hunt down a gang of rogue killers over a few boxes of cherry juice?" "It is not juice," Saurin corrected her, his tone flat. "It is a delicate blend. And yes, I refuse to get my own hands dirty fighting street trash. If you and the Alpha track down the rogues, wipe out their nest, and return my missing crates, I will formally drop the claim on you. The elders will be satisfied. You go free." Callahan clenched his jaw. He hated doing a favor for a vampire. He hated taking orders from a man wearing silk pajamas. But pack law was firm. If he walked away now, the elders would demand he fight the whole coven. He could not afford a full war right now. Plus, the deal gave him an excuse to hit something. The furious wolf in his head wanted blood. The rogues would give the beast a perfect target. "Fine," Callahan growled. His voice was deep and rough. "We find the nest, we kill the thieves, we bring back the crates, then you wipe the slate clean." Excellent, Saurin said. He smiled, showing a flash of sharp white fangs. He leaned back in the velvet chair. I will text you the last known location of the stolen truck. Do try not to break anything else on your way out. The door is already a tragedy. Callahan turned around. He walked toward the ruined doorway, his boots crunching on the broken stone. He did not look back. He expected Fallon to follow. Fallon stood by the wall. She looked at Saurin, then at Callahan's broad back. She let out a loud, dramatic scoff. Great, Fallon announced to the room. Just great. I am trading a furball dictator for a wine snob vampire. Talk about life upgrades. Callahan stopped in the doorway. He did not turn around, but his shoulders went stiff. His super hearing caught every word of her complaint. Get moving, Callahan barked. He stepped out into the cold night air. Fallon rolled her eyes. She stepped over the shattered pieces of the crypt door. She left the quiet warmth of the ruined tomb and followed the Alpha back into the dark woods. Chapter 5. Fallon stumbled over a thick tree root, the thick rubber soles slipping on the damp earth. She threw her hands out to catch her balance and let out a loud, frustrated groan. The dark woods between the Croft Coven graveyard and the Adler Pack grounds offered 0 streetlights. The shadows stretched long and cold across the dirt path. I am never leaving the main roads again, Fallon muttered out loud. She wiped a smudge of dirt off her jeans. Next time I fake my own supernatural kidnapping, I am picking a vampire who lives in a high-rise downtown, with an elevator and carpet. Callahan walked 10 paces ahead of her. He did not slow down. He did not turn around. His broad shoulders blocked out the moonlight. He moved through the dense pine trees with the silent, lethal grace of a predator tracking a meal. His super hearing caught every single word she whispered to the wind. She complains like a bird with a broken wing, the giant wolf inside Callahan's mind rumbled. Turn around, pin her to the nearest tree, bite her neck, claim what is ours. Callahan clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ground together. Shut up, he ordered the beast. We just signed a deal with a bloodsucker to avoid a pack war. I am not marking a liar. Mate, the wolf snarled, pacing in its mental cage. Ours. Callahan ignored the headache throbbing behind his eyes. He broke through the tree line and stepped onto the gravel shoulder of the main boundary road. His truck sat parked in the shadows. It was a heavy, matte black pickup with reinforced steel bumpers and tires built for crushing rocks. He unlocked the doors with a sharp click of his key fob. Fallon dragged herself out of the tree line a minute later. She looked at the towering black truck and let out an exhausted sigh. She walked around to the passenger side, grabbed the handle, and pulled herself up into the cab. Callahan climbed into the driver's seat. He slammed his door shut. The noise echoed in the small, enclosed space of the cab. He jammed the key into the ignition and fired up the engine. The engine roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards. He threw the truck into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. The heavy tires spun in the loose gravel before catching traction. The truck shot forward, tearing down the dark boundary road toward the pack armory. The silence inside the cab felt thicker than the darkness outside. The tension radiating off Callahan's side of the console burned hot enough to start a fire. His gaze stayed locked on the winding road ahead. His thick hands gripped the leather steering wheel. He squeezed the wheel so tight, the material let out a strained, high-pitched groan. Fallon pressed her back against the passenger seat. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared out the passenger window. The dark pine trees blurred past the glass in a smear of black and gray. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass. This is perfect, she whispered to her reflection. Just perfect. I am trapped in a metal box with a ticking time bomb, and I cannot even reach the radio dial without losing a hand. Callahan's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. He whipped the steering wheel to the right, taking a sharp turn a little too fast. The truck fishtailed on the dirt road before straightening out. I can hear you, Callahan growled. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a river. Good, Fallon shot back, not moving her head from the window. Then turn on the heat. I am freezing, and your truck smells like stale coffee and bad decisions. The wolf inside Callahan's head let out a wild, approving bark. The beast loved her sharp tongue. Callahan just hit the gas pedal harder, speeding toward the armory to find something he could punch. Welcome back to Atlena's Romantasy collection, where the alphas run hot and the heroines never keep their mouths shut. Quick question for the pack before we dive into today's chaos. Where are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments and drop a wine glass emoji if you prefer your vampires chill and unbothered, or a wolf emoji if you are here for the brooding alpha. Today we have a wild one. It brings the heat, it brings the laughs, and it involves a very sassy runaway wolf and a furious alpha breaking a coffin right in half. Before we start, if you want to support the channel and get early access to stories like this, hit that join button down below. It helps us keep the lights on and the fresh stories coming. Now take a deep breath. The fake bite mark is drawn, and the alpha is out for blood. Let's read. Chapter 6. Callahan slammed the brakes. The black truck skidded to a halt in front of a square cinder block building on the edge of the Adler training grounds. There were no windows. A heavy steel door stood in the center of the concrete wall, secured by a digital keypad and a thick padlock. Callahan cut the engine. He shoved his door open and stepped out into the night. Fallon rolled her eyes. She pushed her door open and hopped down, her boots hitting the concrete pad with a heavy thud. "Chivalry is dead," she announced to the empty parking lot. Callahan punched a 6-digit code into the keypad. The light blinked green. He grabbed the padlock, entered a combination, and yanked the heavy steel door open. The scent of sharp gun oil and cold iron drifted out of the dark room. Callahan flipped a switch on the wall. A row of harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, buzzing like angry hornets. Fallon stepped inside and whistled. The pack armory held enough firepower to fund a small revolution. Racks of tactical rifles lined the back wall. Wooden crates of ammunition sat stacked on the concrete floor. Rows of knives, machetes, and brass knuckles hung from pegboards. "Do not touch the silver," Callahan ordered. He walked straight to a metal lockbox in the corner of the room. "I know the rules," Fallon muttered, walking down the center aisle. She kept her hands stuffed in her pockets. "Silver burns wolves, burns our skin, poisons our blood. I took basic training." Callahan unlocked the metal box. "The rogues we are hunting do not care about silver. Silver just makes them itch. You need iron, black-forged steel, or ash wood to put a bloodsucker in the ground." He reached into the box and pulled out a curved blade. The metal was pure black, absorbing the harsh light of the room. The handle wrapped in dark leather. He tossed it across the room without a warning. Fallon caught the blade by the handle. The heavy metal settled right into her grip. It was a black-forged steel karambit. The curved edge looked sharp enough to slice through a steel beam. "Aim for the joints or the throat," Callahan said. He turned to a wooden barrel and pulled out a solid ashwood bat. He walked over and shoved the handle against her chest. "If they get close, break their knees, then use the splintered end on the heart." Fallon gripped the bat in her left hand and the karambit in her right. She tested the weight of the wood. It felt balanced, solid. Callahan turned back to the weapons rack. He reached up and pulled down a matte black combat shotgun. The barrel looked as wide as a drain pipe. He grabbed a bandolier of thick red shells and slung it over his broad chest. He shoved 4 shells into the bottom of the gun, then racked the slide back with a sharp, echoing clack. Fallon lowered the bat. She looked at the shotgun, then up at Callahan's unreadable face. "Overcompensating much?" Fallon asked. "We are hunting a few thieves who stole cherry wine, not storming a military compound." Callahan slung the shotgun over his shoulder by its thick nylon strap. He pointed a thick, calloused finger right at the open door. "Get in the truck," Callahan commanded. Fallon sighed. She tucked the karambit into her belt and tapped the ashwood bat against her leg. "Whatever you say, boss. Try not to shoot your own foot off." Chapter 7. Callahan drove the truck 20 miles north to the coordinates Saurin provided. They parked the heavy vehicle on a dirt turnout just off a broken stretch of highway. Beyond the guardrail, the terrain dropped into a thick, tangled nightmare of old-growth forest and jagged rocks. This was the drop site, the spot where the rogue vampires ambushed Saurin's supply truck and hauled the stolen crates into the wild. Fallon stood on the edge of the asphalt. She stared down into the dark expanse of trees. A cold wind whipped through the branches, bringing the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves.
"You have got to be kidding me,"
Fallon said. "They dragged crates of wine through that mess?" Callahan did not answer. He grabbed his shotgun, hopped the metal guardrail, and slid down the steep dirt embankment. He hit the forest floor without making a sound. He knelt in the dirt, running his fingers over a set of deep scuff marks in the mud. Fallon groaned loud enough for a passing car to hear. She threw a leg over the guardrail and scrambled down the hill. Her boots slid on the loose dirt. A branch whipped back and smacked her right in the shoulder. A thick patch of briars snagged the denim of her jeans, ripping a small hole near the knee. She kicked a thick tree root sticking out of the ground. The impact jarred her toes. "I hate dirt," Fallon complained, ripping her jeans free from the thorns. "I hate bugs. I hate nature. This whole planet is a trap." Callahan stood up. He tracked the scuff marks deeper into the brush. He moved with easy, fluid strides, slipping between the thick tree trunks without disturbing a single leaf. His inner wolf let out a high, miserable whine. "She is cold," the beast whimpered in Callahan's mind. "The thorns bite her skin. Give her your jacket. Protect the mate." "It is 70 degrees outside, you idiot," Callahan argued back, staring at the ground to keep his focus. "She is fine. She just likes the sound of her own voice." "Jacket," the wolf demanded, pacing in endless circles. "Now!" Callahan ignored the beast. He walked another 50 yards before stopping near the base of a massive oak tree. He knelt down again. He reached out and picked something out of the dead leaves. Fallon caught up to him, breathing hard. She leaned on her ashwood bat like a walking stick. "Did you find a paved sidewalk?" she asked between breaths. "Because I am done hiking." Callahan held up a broken piece of thick, dark glass. The edge of the glass retained a sticky red residue. The scent of sweet cherries and dark iron hit Fallon's nose. "Saurin's private reserve," Callahan rumbled. He tossed the broken glass back into the dirt. "They dropped a bottle. They are getting sloppy. The trail goes straight up the ridge." Fallon looked at the steep, rocky hill rising in front of them. The rocks looked sharp and unforgiving. "Great," Fallon said. "More uphill walking, my favorite." Callahan checked the safety on his shotgun. He adjusted the strap across his broad chest and started climbing the rocks. Fallon muttered a string of harsh curses to herself and followed the Alpha into the dark. Chapter 8. The shadows stretched long and thin as they reached the top of the rocky ridge. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy of leaves above their heads. The air up here felt different. The normal forest noises, the crickets, the wind rustling the branches, went dead silent. Callahan stopped moving. He held up a closed fist. Fallon stopped 2 paces behind him. She tightened her grip on the ashwood bat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized the unnatural silence. The forest knew predators were near. Above us, the wolf snarled in Callahan's mind. Callahan dropped the shotgun. He let it hang from the thick strap across his chest. He did not have time to raise the barrel. 2 figures dropped from the thick branches of the oak tree directly overhead. They hit the dirt path with a heavy thud, blocking the trail. They wore cheap, scuffed leather jackets and ripped jeans. Their skin looked pale and sickly in the moonlight, and their eyes were blown wide with erratic hunger. Rogue vampires. They moved with a jerky, hyperactive speed, drunk on stolen blood wine. The rogue on the left hissed, bearing a set of long, yellowed fangs. He launched himself right at Callahan's chest. Callahan did not flinch. He let out a roar that shook the leaves on the trees. His body expanded, tearing the seams of his gray shirt. Bones cracked and reformed. Thick, dark fur erupted from his skin. In less than a second, the human man disappeared. A towering 9-foot Lycan beast stood in his place, all corded muscle, razor-sharp claws, and a glowing, lethal stare. The Lycan caught the leaping vampire mid-air. One massive clawed hand wrapped around the rogue's throat, slamming him into the dirt with bone-crushing force. The second rogue dodged the Lycan. He darted to the right, aiming straight for Fallon. Fallon dropped her wooden bat to the dirt. She did not bother pulling the steel karambit from her belt. She felt the familiar, burning rush of adrenaline flood her veins. She threw herself forward and shifted mid-stride. Her human form melted away, replaced by the sleek silver fur of her wolf form. She was smaller than Callahan's towering Lycan, built for pure speed rather than brute strength. She hit the ground on 4 paws, teeth bared in a vicious snarl. The rogue lunged, swiping a clawed hand at her face. Fallon ducked under his arm. She snapped her jaws shut around his calf, her powerful teeth sinking through denim and flesh. She yanked her head back, ripping the rogue's leg out from under him. The vampire hit the ground hard. Before he could roll over, Fallon pounced. She pinned his chest to the dirt with her front paws and drove her teeth straight into his throat. A sickening crunch echoed in the quiet forest. The vampire went limp. A heavy thud sounded behind her. Fallon turned her head. Callahan's Lycan form stood over the remains of the first rogue. He had ripped the vampire's head clean off its shoulders. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. Callahan's broad Lycan chest heaved as he let out a low, victorious rumble. He looked at Fallon's silver wolf form. The beast's expression softened for a fraction of a second before retreating. Callahan shifted back to his human form. The cheap fabric hung in tatters. He stood bare-chested in the cool air, unbothered by the cold. Fallon shifted back a second later. She stood up, shivering in the shredded remains of her clothes. She looked down at her arms. The wet forest floor and the scuffle left thick, brown mud smeared across her elbows and hands. She let out a long, loud groan. "Look at this," Fallon complained to the dead bodies. She held her mud-caked hands out in the moonlight. "I am covered in filth. My hair smells like wet dog and cheap leather. I need a bath, a hot meal, and a vacation." Callahan picked up his shotgun. He looked at her muddy face, the fake bite mark still visible on her neck, and let out a single, rough grunt of amusement. Chapter 9. Fallon wrapped her arms around her torso. The torn strips of her shirt offered zero protection against the biting night air. She stared down at the 2 dead rogues in the dirt. Their cheap leather jackets looked even worse under the pale moonlight. The stench of old iron and rotting leaves hung thick around the bodies. "I need a new wardrobe," Fallon announced to the dark trees, "and a hot shower, and a tetanus shot. This is ridiculous." She walked a few paces and spotted her solid ashwood bat resting in a patch of thorny brush. She picked it up, wiped the dirt off the handle, and used it to lean her weight. Callahan ignored her complaints. He bent down and retrieved his matte black shotgun from the forest floor. He wiped a smudge of mud off the wide barrel. His broad chest rose and fell in a steady, unbroken rhythm. The freezing wind whipped his hair, but he didn't shiver. He turned his head. A jagged line of blood ran down his left bicep. The vampire managed to drag a dirty claw across the muscle during the brief scuffle. "You're bleeding," Fallon pointed out. She gestured at his arm with the wooden bat. "Try not to bleed out. I don't know the way back to your oversized truck, and I'm not dragging your lifeless body down that ridge." "It's a scratch," Callahan grunted. He slung the shotgun over his shoulder by the thick nylon strap. "Let her touch us," the hulking beast growled in his mind. The beast paced a circle in his skull. "Let the mate tend the wound. Claim her now." "Shut up," Callahan ordered the animal. "We have a job to do. I'm not marking a liar." He tilted his head, listening to the forest. "There's a creek a few yards east. Go wash the mud off." Fallon rolled her eyes but followed his lead. They navigated through the dense brush. Tree roots grabbed at her boots. She tripped twice, letting out a string of harsh curses each time. They broke through a thicket of pine trees and found a small, rocky clearing. A narrow creek cut through the stone, the water dark and fast. Callahan went to work. He gathered a pile of dead pine branches. He snapped the thickest wood over his knee with a loud crack, tossing the pieces into a stone ring near the water. He reached into his jeans pocket, pulled out a battered metal lighter, and sparked a flame. The dry pine needles caught fire fast. Orange light pushed the shadows away. Fallon crouched by the edge of the creek. She submerged her hands in the freezing water. The cold bit into her knuckles like sharp needles. She scrubbed the dark mud off her skin, gritting her teeth against the chill. When her hands were clean, she stood up and walked toward the fire. Callahan sat on a fallen log near the flames. He held his injured arm out toward the heat. The cut looked deep, angry, and caked with dried mud. "That's going to get infected," Fallon muttered. She set her ashwood bat against the log. "Bloodsuckers carry terrible diseases. You'll catch rabies or something worse." She looked down at her shredded shirt. She grabbed the longest, cleanest strip of fabric hanging near her waist. She yanked hard. The cotton tore with a sharp rip. She walked back to the creek, dipped the cloth in the icy water, and returned to the fire. "Hold still," Fallon ordered. She pressed the wet, freezing cloth against his bicep. Callahan's muscles jumped under her touch, feeling like solid rock, but he didn't pull away. The heat radiating off his bare skin rivaled the campfire. Fallon wiped the dirt and dried blood away with firm, deliberate strokes. She leaned closer to get a better angle on the cut. As she closed the distance, his scent washed over her. It was a sharp, grounding mix of crushed cedar and fresh rain. The fragrance wrapped around her senses, chasing the cold out of her bones. A sudden, intense rush of heat flooded her cheeks. She stared at the thick cords of muscle in his arm. The firelight cast deep shadows over his chest. "Stop looking at his arms," Fallon whispered to herself. She scrubbed the cut a little harder. "Stop looking at his arms right now. He's a dictator. He kidnapped you." Callahan's ears twitched. A low, rumbling smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. The fire illuminated the flash of amusement in his gaze. "I heard that," he said. His voice was a deep gravel scrape. "I don't care," Fallon shot back. She finished cleaning the wound and stepped back fast. She tossed the bloody, ruined rag straight into the fire. The flames hissed and spat. "Your ego is already massive. Keep the dirt out of the cut. I'm done playing nurse for the evening." Callahan didn't argue. The smirk stayed on his face. His inner wolf let out a satisfied purr. He watched her cross her arms and turn her back to the wind. "She likes us," the beast announced. For once, Callahan didn't tell the wolf to shut up. Chapter 10. Callahan stood up from the log. The fire popped, sending bright sparks into the dark sky. "Stay by the heat," Callahan ordered. "I need to check the bodies." "Take your time," Fallon muttered, inching closer to the flames. "I love standing around in the freezing woods wearing half a shirt. This is a dream vacation." Callahan turned his back and disappeared into the tree line. The shadows swallowed his massive frame in seconds. Fallon stood alone by the fire, listening to the crackle of the burning pine. She rubbed her bare arms to ward off the chill. The adrenaline from the ambush faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. A few minutes later, heavy footsteps crunched on the dry leaves. Callahan emerged from the dark. He held a crumpled, stained piece of paper in his right hand. "Find a treasure map?" Fallon asked. She leaned on her ashwood bat. "Please tell me it leads to a hotel with room service." Callahan ignored her sarcasm. He walked to the fire and squatted down, holding the paper toward the orange light. Fallon stepped closer and peered over his broad shoulder. The paper was a crude, hand-drawn map of the Adler Pack territory. The borders were marked with thick black marker. Several red X's dotted the landscape. "They drew this in crayon," Fallon observed. "These are the elite killers we're hunting?" They steal vintage wine and use kindergarten art supplies to plan their wars. Look at the targets, Callahan said. He pointed a thick finger at the largest red X on the paper. Fallon traced the line. The X sat right in the middle of the Eastern Valley. That's the geothermal basin, Fallon said, her brow furrowing. The natural hot springs. The elders use that area for the winter solstice rituals. The rogues don't want Saurin's wine, Callahan growled. He crushed the edge of the paper in his fist. The wine was just a distraction, a way to pull Saurin out of his crypt or force a fight. They want the Adler land. Fallon stared at the crude drawing. A scoff escaped her lips. The sound echoed in the quiet clearing. Let me get this straight, Fallon said. She pointed her bat at the map. They want to wipe out a pack of werewolves to gain access to warm water? They want to start a blood war over a spa day? Idiots. Complete fools. She is right, the wolf rumbled in Callahan's mind. The leeches are stupid. Tear their throats out. Protect the territory. We will, Callahan promised the beast. The hot springs contain high levels of sulfur and natural minerals, Callahan explained. He stood up, folding the map and shoving it into his jeans pocket. For a vampire, bathing in those springs accelerates their healing. It makes them stronger. If a rogue nest takes the basin, they can build an army of unkillable soldiers. Fallon groaned. Great, so we aren't just playing delivery drivers for a wine snob vampire. We're preventing a full-scale invasion of immortal super soldiers. Yes, Callahan stated. I should have stayed home, Fallon complained. She kicked a pebble into the fire. I could be eating bad deer meat right now, but no, I had to fake a bite mark. I'm my own worst enemy. Callahan picked up his shotgun. He checked the action, ensuring a red shell sat ready in the chamber. He looked up at the sky. The pale moonlight vanished behind a thick wall of dark, bruised clouds. The wind picked up, howling through the pine branches. A heavy drop of cold rain hit Fallon right on the nose. She blinked. She looked up at the black sky. Another drop hit her cheek, followed by a dozen more. Within seconds, the sky opened up. A torrential downpour crashed through the canopy. The rain hit the campfire with a loud hiss, turning the bright flames into a smoking pile of wet ash. You've got to be kidding me, Fallon yelled over the sound of the storm. The icy water plastered her hair to her face and soaked the remains of her shirt. Callahan grabbed her elbow. His grip was firm but lacked the bruising force from the pack haul. Move, Callahan ordered. The map shows an old hunting cabin half a mile north. We need cover. The mud on the forest floor turned into a slick, treacherous slide. Fallon lost her footing twice, her knees slamming into the dirt. Callahan caught her by the waist the second time, hauling her upright without breaking his stride. The touch of his hot hands on her freezing skin sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. I can walk, Fallon shouted over the rain, though her teeth chattered. Then pick your feet up, Callahan shouted back. He didn't let go of her waist. He carried her up the next steep incline. The rain washed the remaining blood off his arm, leaving the angry red cut exposed to the elements. Through the curtain of water, the dark outline of a square wooden structure appeared against the tree line. Cabin, Callahan pointed. They sprinted the last 50 yards, desperate to escape the biting chill.
Chapter 11.
Callahan kicked the cabin door open. The wooden hinges screamed in protest, but the door gave way. They spilled into the dark interior, bringing a gust of wind and rain with them. Callahan slammed the door shut, cutting off the worst of the storm. The cabin was a rotting nightmare. The single room smelled of mildew and old dust. The roof sagged in the center, and water dripped through the wooden slats in a steady, maddening rhythm. There was no furniture. No bed, no chairs, and no fireplace. Just a moth-eaten rug lying in the center of the wooden floorboards. Fallon dropped her ashwood bat. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. The shredded remains of her shirt clung to her wet skin. 5-star accommodations, Fallon muttered through chattering teeth. "I'll be sure to leave a glowing review." Callahan leaned his shotgun against the wall near the door. He stood in the center of the room. The rain washed his ruined gray shirt away, leaving his broad chest bare. Water ran down his torso in thick streams, dripping from his dark jeans onto the floorboards. Despite the freezing temperature, steam radiated off his hot skin. He ran a hand through his wet hair, pushing it out of his eyes. He scanned the corners of the room, ensuring no rogues waited in the shadows. The cabin was empty. "Sit on the rug," Callahan ordered. His voice lacked its usual harsh edge. "The floorboards are rotting. You'll catch a splinter." Fallon trudged over to the center of the room. She dropped onto the moth-eaten rug, crossing her legs. The fabric felt coarse and smelled like old dirt, but it provided a tiny barrier against the freezing wood. She rubbed her arms, trying to generate friction. It didn't work. The cold sat deep in her bones. Callahan walked over and sat down beside her. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned his back against a sturdy support beam. He stared at the dripping roof, his expression unreadable. Fallon looked at him. She looked at the steam rising from his shoulders. She let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Listen," Fallon said out loud, her voice shaking. "You run hotter than a furnace. I'm freezing to death. I'm using you for body heat. Deal with it." She didn't wait for his permission. She scooted across the rug until her side pressed flush against his ribs. She tucked her freezing hands under his arm for maximum warmth. Callahan went solid rigid. Every muscle in his body locked down. He stopped breathing for a full 5 seconds. Inside his mind, the giant wolf let out a thunderous howl of triumph. The beast did a mental victory lap, pacing the confines of his skull with pure, unfiltered joy. "Mate," the wolf roared. "Hold her! Keep her warm! Mine!" Callahan closed his eyes. He forced himself to exhale a slow, measured breath. "Calm down," he told the animal. "Don't scare her away." He shifted his weight, adjusting his posture to block the draft coming from the crack under the door. He didn't wrap his arms around her, but he leaned into her touch. The intense heat of his body soaked into her freezing skin like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Fallon let out a soft groan of relief. "Don't let this go to your head," she mumbled against his side. "You're just a very large, very grumpy space heater." "Noted," Callahan rumbled. The vibration of his deep voice traveled through his chest and into her shoulder. It was a comforting, solid sensation. Fallon closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion drag her down. The sound of the rain hammering the roof faded into the background. For the first time since she faked the bite mark, she felt safe. Callahan kept his eyes open. He watched the dark corners of the cabin, listening to the storm. The scent of rain and mud masked their presence from any tracking rogues. He felt the steady rhythm of Fallon's breathing as she drifted toward sleep. He remembered the challenge in her eyes when she stood in the pack hall. He remembered the vicious speed of her silver wolf form during the ambush. She wasn't the spoiled runaway he thought she was. She had teeth, and she knew how to use them. The Alpha rested his head against the wooden beam. The long night stretched out ahead of them, cold and wet, but the fire inside his chest burned hotter than ever. Chapter 12. The storm raged outside for hours. The wind battered the thin walls of the cabin, making the old wood groan. Water pooled in the corners of the room, but the center rug remained dry. Fallon woke up to the sound of a distant thunderclap. She blinked her eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling. She realized she was no longer just sitting beside Callahan. At some point during her sleep, she had curled her body flush against his side. Her head rested on his solid chest, rising and falling with his steady breaths. She scrambled to sit up, her face flushing hot in the dark. "Sorry," Fallon blurted out. She pulled her knees to her chest. "I must have shifted in my sleep. Blame the cold." Callahan didn't move. He sat in the exact same position, his back against the wooden beam. He stared straight ahead into the gloom. "You talk in your sleep," Callahan said. His voice sounded rough, carrying the weight of the dark room. Fallon cringed. "What did I say? If I insulted your truck, I stand by it." "You muttered about the border patrols," Callahan said. He turned his head, his gaze piercing through the shadows. "You complained about the cold rain and the bad meat. You said you were drowning." Fallon looked away. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I was dreaming. Don't read into it." "Why did you lie to the elders?" Callahan asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. "Why choose a vampire lord to claim you? You knew the punishment for treason." Fallon stared at a water droplet falling from the ceiling. It hit a puddle on the floor with a soft plink. "Because I wanted out," Fallon said out loud, dropping her sarcastic shield for a moment. "I spend every single day walking the perimeter. I follow orders, I train, I eat whatever slop the cooks throw on a plate. I have no choices. The pack dictates my entire existence. I figured a fake bite mark was the fastest way to get fired and walk away." Callahan stayed quiet. He rubbed a hand over his face. The gesture looked heavy, stripped of his usual stoic armor. "You think you're the only one drowning," Callahan said. The words carried a bitter edge. Fallon turned her head to look at him. "I took the alpha position when I was 19, Callahan continued. His voice dropped to a low rumble. "My father died in a border skirmish. The elders shoved the title onto my shoulders before the blood was dry on the dirt. I didn't get a choice either." He looked down at his calloused hands. "Every decision I make affects 300 lives. Every mistake costs blood. I spend my days breaking up petty fights and my nights planning wars against rogues who want our land. It feels like wearing a tight steel rope around my throat. If I relax for a single second, the rope chokes me." His inner wolf whined, a low sound of shared misery. Protect the pack, bear the weight. Fallon stared at the alpha. She expected anger, arrogance, or a lecture on duty. She didn't expect raw exhaustion. She saw the dark circles under his eyes and the tense set of his jaw. The invincible leader of the Adler pack looked like a man carrying a boulder on his back. Fallon hummed, a soft, understanding sound. "Heavy is the head that wears the crown of fur," Fallon said in a soft voice. Callahan let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like a sigh. "Something like that," he agreed. "For what it's worth," Fallon said, leaning her chin on her knees, "I didn't think you cared. I thought you just liked yelling at people and breaking antique doors." "I care about my people," Callahan said. He looked her right in the eyes. "I care about you. That's why I didn't let you walk away with a fake mark." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. A spark of genuine connection flared between them in the cold, damp cabin. The hostility that defined their relationship cracked wide open. Fallon swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. She looked away first, unable to handle the intensity of his stare. "Well?" Fallon muttered, scooting back to his side and resting her shoulder against his arm. "If we survive the vampire army and get Saurin's wine back, maybe I'll stay. But I demand better meat on Tuesdays." Callahan rested his head back against the beam. A genuine smile touched his lips. "Deal." Chapter 13. The torrential storm broke just before dawn. The heavy rain faded into a cold, misty drizzle. Pale gray light filtered through the sagging roof of the hunting cabin, illuminating the rotting floorboards and the moth-eaten rug. Fallon pushed herself up from the floor. Her muscles ached. The damp air chilled her straight to the bone. The shredded strips of her shirt offered zero warmth, and her denim jeans felt like wet cement against her legs. She grabbed her ashwood bat from the floor, using it to stretch her stiff shoulders. Callahan stood near the broken door. He watched the tree line. His bare chest and broad shoulders remained unaffected by the freezing temperature. The jagged cut on his left bicep looked angry and red, but the bleeding had stopped. He pulled the crumpled, crayon-drawn map from his front pocket and studied the red markings. "We are close," Callahan rumbled. His voice broke the morning silence. "The warehouse sits in the valley just below this ridge." "Fantastic," Fallon muttered out loud. She kicked a loose piece of wood. Another hike through the wet dirt. I hope the vampires have coffee. If I have to fight an immortal army on an empty stomach, I am going to lose my temper. Callahan did not argue. He folded the map, shoved it back into his jeans, and picked up his matte black combat shotgun. He stepped out of the cabin and into the gray morning mist. Fallon followed him. The mud on the forest floor made the descent down the ridge treacherous. Tree roots, slick with rain, threatened to trip her with every step. She used the wooden bat as a walking stick, stabbing it into the dirt to keep her balance. I am billing the pack for a new wardrobe, Fallon complained to the trees. She swatted a wet pine branch out of her face. And a spa day, a real one, not a sulfur pit filled with bloodsuckers. She complains with every breath, the giant wolf in Callahan's mind grumbled. Bite her neck, make her quiet. Leave her alone, Callahan ordered the beast. He kept his eyes on the trail. She survived the night. She earned the right to complain. They reached the edge of the tree line after an hour of grueling hiking. The thick woods opened up to reveal a wide, rocky valley. In the center of the clearing stood a towering, rusted metal structure. The warehouse looked abandoned. Weeds grew through the cracked concrete parking lot. The corrugated steel roof featured large, gaping holes. Callahan dropped to a crouch behind a thick boulder. He motioned for Fallon to get down. Fallon dropped to her knees in the wet dirt, hiding behind the rock. She peered over the top. That place looks like a tetanus trap. Are we sure Saurin's expensive wine is in there? Callahan adjusted the heavy shotgun strap across his chest. Before he could answer, a sharp electronic buzz vibrated from his front pocket. Fallon jumped. She stared at his soaked dark jeans. Did you bring a phone? How is that thing even working? We stood in a monsoon for 3 hours last night. Military-grade case, Callahan grunted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, rubber-coated smartphone. The screen glowed bright in the gloom. He tapped the screen to open a new message. It was a text from Saurin. The screen displayed a high-definition photo. Saurin sat in a luxurious clawfoot bathtub filled to the brim with white bubbles. He held a crystal glass of dark red liquid in one hand and wore a waterproof silk shower cap on his head. Below the photo, the text read, "Are you dead yet? My esthetician is coming at noon, and I need the noise kept to a minimum." A thick vein bulged on the side of Callahan's neck. His amber gaze burned with pure, unfiltered rage. The wolf inside his skull let out a furious roar, demanding blood. Callahan crushed his hand into a fist. The thick, rubber-coated smartphone shattered under his grip. The glass screen spiderwebbed, and the metal casing bent with a harsh crunch. He dropped the ruined pieces of technology into the dirt. Fallon stared at the broken phone. She looked up at Callahan's locked jaw. "Well," Fallon said out loud, her voice echoing over the quiet ridge, "there goes our GPS. Good job, Smashy. Now we have to ask the vampires for directions home." Callahan racked the shotgun. The metallic clack sounded loud and final. "We do not need directions. We just follow the blood." Chapter 14. Callahan led the way down the final slope of the ridge. The gray morning mist clung to the ground, hiding the cracked concrete of the warehouse parking lot. The air smelled of wet rust and old engine oil. Fallon gripped her ashwood bat tighter. She kept her other hand near her belt, ready to draw the black-forged steel karambit. Her boots splashed in deep puddles of rainwater. The shredded strips of her shirt offered no comfort against the biting wind whipping through the valley. "Place looks dead," Fallon whispered. She scanned the rusted exterior of the building. No guards, no lookouts, not exactly a master tactical operation. "Do not underestimate them," Callahan warned. He kept the matte black shotgun raised, the stock pressed firm against his shoulder. His eyes darted across the shattered windows running along the top of the steel walls. They approached a heavy side door. The metal looked warped and covered in thick orange rust. Callahan reached out and tested the handle. It turned without resistance. The door swung open, the hinges screaming a high-pitched protest. They stepped out of the morning light and into the cavernous dark of the warehouse. The interior was vast and empty. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light piercing through the ruined roof. Towering shelves of rusted metal lined the walls, holding nothing but empty wooden pallets and discarded trash. The air felt stale, heavy with the scent of mildew. "I do not smell the wine," Callahan murmured. His superhearing strained to pick up the sound of heartbeats or breathing. He heard nothing but the wind rattling the steel roof. "Maybe they drank it all," Fallon suggested. She walked past a stack of wooden crates, tapping her bat against her leg. "Or maybe your crayon map was wrong. Let us just go home. I want real food." Callahan took another step toward the center of the vast room. His boots crunched on broken glass. "Something is wrong." The giant beast in his head snarled. "The air is too still. Danger. Protect the mate." Callahan stopped. He turned his head toward the door they just walked through. A loud hydraulic hiss echoed through the empty warehouse. The heavy, rusted steel door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The ground vibrated beneath their boots. Heavy deadbolts clicked into place on the outside, one after another, sealing them in the dark. Fallon spun around. She ran to the door and shoved her shoulder against the metal. It did not budge. She kicked it with her heavy boot. The steel felt like a solid brick wall. "Locked!" Fallon yelled. She turned back to face the center of the room. "It is a setup!" High above them, a row of harsh industrial halogen lights flickered to life. The blinding white glare washed over the warehouse floor, erasing the shadows. Then the music started. A static-filled crackle burst from a set of cheap, blown-out speakers mounted to the support beams. A harsh, upbeat, and terrible disco song blared at maximum volume. The heavy bass vibrated the floorboards, and the electronic synthesizers screeched over the speakers. Fallon dropped her bat to the floor and clamped both hands over her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut against the noise. Callahan winced. With his heightened werewolf senses, the blaring disco music felt like physical needles stabbing into his eardrums. He fought through the pain, sweeping the barrel of the shotgun across the empty room. "Okay," Fallon yelled over the screeching vocals of the song. She pulled her hands away from her ears and picked her bat back up. Her face flushed red with genuine anger. "Now I am actually mad. Trap me in a rusty box all you want, but this playlist is a crime." Callahan backed up until his bare shoulders hit the sealed steel door. He pulled Fallon close to his side, keeping her behind the wide arc of his gun barrel. The music masked any sound of footsteps. They were blind to the approach. The ambush was perfect. The vampires waited for them to walk right into the center of the cage. Chapter 15. The awful disco music echoed off the metal walls. The upbeat tempo clashed hard with the suffocating tension in the room. Callahan kept his finger near the trigger of the combat shotgun. He tracked every shift in the light. Movement caught his eye on the second-floor catwalk. A figure stepped out from behind a rusted support pillar, then another. Down on the main floor, shadows detached from the stacks of wooden pallets. The halogen lights illuminated pale, sickly skin and glowing, hungry eyes. 20 rogue vampires stepped into the open. They wore cheap leather jackets, ripped denim, and heavy combat boots. They looked like street thugs, but they moved with unnatural, gliding speed. They fanned out across the warehouse floor, forming a wide half-circle that boxed Callahan and Fallon against the sealed steel door. The giant wolf in Callahan's skull let out a deafening roar. "Kill them! Rip their throats out! Paint the floor red!" the beast demanded. Callahan grounded himself, locking his stance. He racked the shotgun. The sharp clack cut through the blaring music for a split second. The bandolier of thick red shells hung heavy across his chest. He aimed the wide barrel straight at the center of the approaching pack. The rogues stopped 10 paces away. A tall vampire with greasy blonde hair and a scarred jaw stepped forward. He held a rusted iron pipe in his right hand, tapping it against his thigh in time with the disco beat. He looked at Callahan's bare, muscular chest and the heavy shotgun, then his gaze slid over to Fallon's shredded clothes and mud-stained face. The rogue leader smiled, revealing a row of yellowed, jagged fangs. Fallon did not shrink back. She stepped out from behind Callahan's broad shoulder. She planted her boots firm on the concrete. She held the solid ashwood bat in her left hand and drew the black-forged steel karambit from her belt with her right. The dark, curved blade gleamed under the harsh lights. "Who picked the playlist?" Fallon yelled over the music. She pointed her wooden bat right at the scarred rogue leader. "I just want to talk. Turn this garbage off before I break your stereo." The rogue leader laughed. The sound was a harsh, dry rasp. "You got a big mouth for a stray dog," the rogue yelled back. He lifted the iron pipe and pointed it at Callahan. "The Alpha of the Adler Pack, right where we wanted you. We are going to take your territory, sleep in your warm springs, and drink your little stray dry." Callahan felt the fury burn through his veins. His amber eyes flared bright. He did not bother trading insults with a dead man walking. He tightened his grip on the shotgun.
"Get behind me,"
Callahan ordered Fallon. His voice was a deep, guttural rumble. "Not a chance!" Fallon shouted back. She twirled the karambit in her hand, the heavy steel settling into her grip. "I am freezing, I am tired, and I hate this song. Let us end this." The rogue leader raised his hand. The 19 other vampires hunched forward, their muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. They bared their fangs, hissing like a nest of cornered snakes. The sheer numbers gave them a total advantage. 20 immortal killers against 1 alpha and a half-frozen runaway. "Tear them apart," the rogue leader commanded. The vampires launched themselves forward in a blur of terrifying speed, swarming toward the steel door. The music hit a high, screeching crescendo. Callahan pulled the trigger. Chapter 16. The combat shotgun erupted. A blast of heavy buckshot tore through the air, hitting the closest rogue dead in the chest. The impact threw the vampire backward, sending him crashing into a stack of wooden pallets. The wood splintered with a loud crack. Callahan pumped the action and fired again. Another deafening boom shook the warehouse. A second rogue caught the blast in the shoulder, spinning wild into the dirt. But there were too many of them. The vampires did not slow down. They moved in a rapid, chaotic swarm, dodging the spread of the shotgun and closing the distance fast. Fallon swung her ashwood bat. A rogue lunged at her face. She stepped into the swing, driving the solid wood straight into the vampire's kneecap. The joint shattered with a sickening crunch. The rogue shrieked, dropping to the floor. Fallon reversed her grip and drove the black-forged steel karambit down, sinking the curved blade into the vampire's back. Callahan fired his third shot, blowing a rogue off his feet. The remaining vampires swarmed him, grabbing at his bare arms and the barrel of the gun. A clawed hand slashed across his ribs, drawing a fresh line of hot blood. "Too many," the wolf roared in his mind. "Blind them!" Callahan dropped the shotgun. It clattered against the concrete. He reached behind his back, feeling the heavy leather pouches attached to his tactical belt. His fingers closed over a smooth, heavy metal cylinder. He pulled the flashbang grenade free. He yanked the metal pin out with his teeth and spit it onto the floor. "Close your eyes!" Callahan roared over the blaring disco music. Fallon heard the command. She ripped the karambit out of the fallen rogue and squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face toward the steel door. Callahan dropped the grenade right at his own feet. The flashbang detonated. A blinding, brilliant flash of pure white light exploded in the center of the dark warehouse. The blast erased all shadows. A concussive wave of sound hit like a physical blow, overpowering the awful music and leaving a high-pitched ringing in the air. The vampires shrieked in agony. Their sensitive eyes burned under the intense light. They stumbled backward, clawing at their faces, completely blinded and disoriented. Callahan took the brunt of the flash. He squeezed his eyes shut a second too late. Bright white spots burned into his vision. He stumbled, his heightened hearing overwhelmed by the ringing noise. He could not see, he could not hear the enemy. A small, cold hand grabbed his thick leather belt and yanked hard. "Come on, big guy, pick up your feet," Fallon yelled. Her voice cut through the ringing in his ears. She kept her eyes locked on the far wall. The rogue leader's ambush left a glaring flaw in their trap. The warehouse brick wall on the far right side looked crumbling and rotten from years of water damage. Fallon dragged Callahan forward, using all her weight to pull the hulking Alpha through the chaotic swarm of blinded vampires. She swung her bat blind, connecting with a rogue's ribs to clear a path. They reached the rotting brick wall. "Hit it!" Fallon shouted, shoving Callahan forward. Callahan trusted her voice. He balled his hands into fists, squared his broad shoulders, and drove his entire body weight forward. He slammed into the weakened brick like a runaway freight train. The rotten wall gave way. Bricks shattered and mortar crumbled. They burst through the hole in a cloud of red dust, tumbling out of the rusted warehouse and crashing hard into the wet dirt of the valley outside. Chapter 17. Fallon hit the ground hard. The impact drove the air from her lungs. Broken bricks and ruined mortar rained down around her, covering her shredded clothes in a thick layer of red dust. She gasped, fighting to pull oxygen back into her chest. The wet dirt of the valley floor felt like a bed of ice against her skin. Beside her, Callahan hit the mud with the force of a falling oak tree. The hulking Alpha rolled onto his side. He squeezed his eyes shut. The flashbang blast did its job too well. The brilliant detonation left him blind. A high-pitched, endless ringing drowned out all other sounds in his ears. He reached out with a thick hand, his fingers digging into the cold mud, searching for an anchor. Fallon scrambled to her knees. She coughed, spitting the taste of old brick out of her mouth. The terrible disco music still blared from the gaping hole in the warehouse wall, mixing with the furious shrieks of the blinded rogues inside. She looked at the Alpha. A fresh, jagged scratch ran across his ribs, leaking dark blood down his torso. "Get up!" Fallon yelled. She crawled over to him and grabbed his thick leather belt. "They will recover in a minute. We need to move." Callahan shook his head. He could not hear her words. He only felt the tug on his belt. "We are blind," his inner wolf snarled, pacing the confines of his skull in a panic. "The mate leads us. Trust the mate." Callahan gritted his teeth and forced himself onto his knees. Fallon threw her shoulder under his arm. She used every ounce of strength in her legs to haul him upright. He towered over her, his weight immense, but he kept his balance in the slick mud. "Walk," Fallon ordered, pushing him forward. They stumbled away from the rusted warehouse. Fallon steered them toward a cluster of tall, gray boulders resting near the edge of the tree line. She shoved the Alpha behind the rock formation and pressed her own back against the cold stone. She gripped her ashwood bat tight, her knuckles turning white. She peeked around the jagged edge of the boulder. Inside the warehouse, the halogen lights cast harsh, blinding beams through the broken wall. The disco song hit a screeching synthesizer solo. A figure stepped through the rubble. It was the rogue leader. He wiped red brick dust from his scarred jaw. He gripped the rusted iron pipe in his right hand. His eyes scanned the dark, wet valley. The flashbang missed him, or he recovered faster than the rest of his crew. The rogue leader stepped into the mud. He raised the iron pipe high in the air. "Adler!" the rogue leader screamed. His raspy voice cut through the cold wind, echoing off the steep ridge. "You cannot hide from us! You cannot run! We will hunt you down! We will take your hot springs! We will slaughter your warriors, and we will burn your entire pack to ashes!" Fallon rolled her eyes. She leaned her head back against the boulder and let out a loud groan. "I cannot stand bad writing," Fallon muttered out loud. She stepped out from behind the boulder. She stood in the open, her boots sinking into the puddles. She cupped her free hand around her mouth, took a deep breath, and shouted back at the warehouse. "Get new material!" Fallon yelled. Her voice rang clear across the valley. "The fire and ash speech is boring. Try reading a book." The rogue leader froze. He lowered the iron pipe, staring at the lone woman heckling him from the shadows. Behind Fallon, Callahan blinked. The bright white spots dancing across his vision began to fade. The dark shapes of the valley returned to focus. The ringing in his ears dialed down to a dull hum, just in time to hear her shouting insults at an immortal killer. Callahan pushed himself off the boulder, his feral gaze locked onto her. "Are you insane?" Callahan asked. His voice sounded like grinding gravel. Fallon turned around. She dropped her hand. "Your eyes work? Good. Your ears work? Even better. Let us climb this hill before he sends 19 angry friends out here." Callahan looked down at his empty hands. The realization hit him. The combat shotgun remained on the concrete floor inside the warehouse. He left his primary weapon behind in the chaos. He clenched his fists. The knuckles cracked with a sharp snap. "I lost the gun," Callahan rumbled. "You still have arms the size of tree trunks," Fallon pointed out. She tapped his uninjured bicep with her wooden bat. "We use those. Walk." They turned their backs on the warehouse and started the brutal climb up the ridge. The rain had stopped, but the storm left the incline slick and treacherous. Every step required effort. Fallon used the ashwood bat as a crutch, driving the tip into the mud to pull herself up. Briars tore at her jeans. The cold air burned her lungs. Callahan followed right behind her. His bare chest radiated heat, chasing away the worst of the chill. When Fallon slipped on a wet tree root, his thick hand shot out, catching her waist and pushing her forward without a word. They crested the ridge after 20 grueling minutes. The black pickup truck sat parked on the gravel shoulder, safe and untouched. Callahan unlocked the doors. Fallon climbed into the passenger seat, throwing her bat onto the floorboards with a heavy clatter. She pulled the black forged steel karambit from her belt and set it on the center console. She sank into the leather seat, shivering. Callahan got behind the wheel. He fired up the engine. The heavy tires spun, throwing wet gravel into the trees, and the truck sped down the dark boundary road, leaving the valley behind. Chapter 18. The drive back to the Croft Coven graveyard felt longer than the trip out. The silence inside the cab of the black truck hung thick and heavy. Callahan kept his hands locked on the steering wheel, his jaw muscles feathered. The loss of his shotgun gnawed at his pride, and the fresh scratch on his ribs throbbed with a dull ache. Fallon sat in the passenger seat, holding her hands in front of the dashboard vents. The warm air blasted against her freezing skin. She stared out the window at the passing trees. "This is a disaster," Fallon announced to the glass. "We lost the gun. We did not find the wine. We almost died listening to the worst song ever recorded. And now we are going back to the vampire lord to ask for help. I hope he offers me a towel." Callahan did not argue. His inner wolf paced in silence, brooding over the retreat. The beast hated running from a fight, even an unwinnable one. The truck turned off the main road and crunched to a halt near the rusty iron gates of the graveyard. They left the vehicle and walked down the cracked cobblestone path. The wind howled around the crumbling headstones, rustling the dead grass. They reached the crypt. The shattered chunks of the stone door remained in a pile on the floor. Nothing had changed. Callahan stepped over the rubble and entered the tomb. Fallon followed, shivering as the damp graveyard air clung to her shredded clothes. Saurin sat in the velvet armchair in the corner of the room. He no longer wore his blue pajamas. He wore a long, flowing black silk robe tied at the waist. He held a crystal file in his right hand, smoothing the edges of his nails. A fresh glass of dark red liquid sat on the wooden side table next to him. The splintered remains of the pine coffin still cluttered the center rug. Saurin looked up from his nails. He took in Callahan's bare, blood-stained chest and Fallon's mud-caked jeans. "You look terrible," Saurin observed. He pointed the nail file at Callahan. "And you are empty-handed. Tell me you did not break my vintage bottles. I will bill you for every single drop." "They did not have your crates," Callahan growled. He reached into his dark jeans and pulled out the crumpled, crayon-drawn map. He tossed the paper onto the side table next to Saurin's glass. The theft was a distraction, a trick to get you out of the crypt or force a pact conflict. Saurin picked up the map with 2 fingers. He studied the crude red marks. His unbothered expression did not change. "They want the geothermal basin," Fallon said out loud, stepping further into the room. "The hot springs on Adlerland. They want to bathe in the sulfur and turn themselves into immortal super soldiers. They plan to march on the pack tonight." Saurin sighed. He dropped the map back onto the table. "Street trash with ambitions. How tedious. I suppose this means my wine is gone forever. Tragic." "Your wine is the least of our problems," Callahan snapped. He stepped closer to the velvet chair, his hulking frame casting a shadow over the vampire lord. "The rogues number at least 24. They are marching on the border when the moon rises. I need bodies on the line. I need your coven." Saurin leaned back in the chair. He crossed his legs, the black silk whispering against the fabric. He picked up his glass and took a slow sip. "Let me understand this," Saurin said. "You broke my door. You destroyed my pine box. You failed to retrieve my stolen property. And now you want me to risk my favorite suits in a mud brawl against a gang of unwashed thieves." Callahan bared his teeth. A low rumble started in his chest. "Rip his throat out," the wolf demanded. "Take his warriors by force." "We need the numbers," Callahan said, forcing the words out. "He makes a fair point," Fallon chimed in. She crossed her arms. "We did wreck his house. It is a tough sell." Saurin pointed his glass at her. "Thank you. At last, someone with manners." He looked back at Callahan. "I detest rogues. They give my kind a bad reputation. I will lend you my fighters, but there is a price." "Name it," Callahan said. "First, you replace this door," Saurin demanded, gesturing to the rubble. "Solid steel this time. Second, you buy me a new espresso machine, the imported Italian kind. My old one makes a terrible grinding noise." Fallon uncrossed her arms. "Just buy him the machine, Alpha. He gets cranky without his caffeine." Saurin pointed a long finger at Fallon. "Listen to the girl. She understands civilization." Callahan gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He nodded once. The alliance was set. Chapter 19. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and bruised black. The cold wind swept through the Adler Pack territory, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Callahan stood at the edge of the boundary line. He stared into the dark expanse of the old-growth forest. His chest remained bare, the cool air doing nothing to soothe the heat radiating from his skin. The fresh cut on his ribs had scabbed over, a testament to his accelerated healing. Behind him, the Adler Pack gathered for war. 50 wolves stood in the clearing. They did not shift. They waited in their human forms, holding their ground in grim silence. They carried heavy iron pipes, thick ashwood spears, and black-forged steel blades. No one carried silver. The risk of dropping a weapon and burning a packmate was too high. Elders Thomas, Henry, and Arthur stood near the back of the formation. They wore their dark sweaters, their wrinkled faces lined with genuine fear. They muttered among themselves, casting nervous glances at the tree line. Fallon stood 2 paces to Callahan's right. She still wore the shredded strips of her wet shirt and her muddy jeans. She shivered, her hands gripped tight around the handle of her solid ashwood bat. The black-forged steel karambit rested secure in her belt. "I am going to catch pneumonia," Fallon complained out loud to the empty woods. "If the vampires do not kill me, the common cold will finish the job. Put that on my headstone. Tragic victim of a drafty forest." Callahan did not turn his head, but his ear twitched. "She complains, but she stays," his inner wolf rumbled, a note of pride bleeding through the beast's thoughts. "Brave mate. Ours." "Keep your bat up," Callahan ordered. His voice was a low, steady anchor in the tense air. "Aim for the knees. Break their foundation." "I know how to swing a stick," Fallon shot back. She shifted her weight, rolling her stiff shoulders. Above them, the clouds parted. The full moon emerged, a glowing silver coin suspended in the dark sky. The pale light washed over the clearing, illuminating the dirt path leading into the valley. The energy of the moon hit the pack like a physical wave. Muscles tightened, feral stares flashed gold. The urge to shift pulled at their bones, but Callahan held them back with a silent command. The crunch of boots on gravel broke the silence. The rogues were coming. The first row of vampires stepped out of the shadows. They moved with that same jerky, erratic speed, their cheap leather jackets rustling in the wind. The moonlight caught their pale skin and their bared fangs. There were over 24 of them, a swarm of street killers drunk on the promise of the hot springs. But before the enemy broke past the tree line, a different sound echoed from the north side of the clearing. It sounded like the clattering of thin aluminum and the squeak of plastic wheels. Callahan turned his head. Fallon lowered her bat. Saurin walked out of the shadows. He wore a pristine, dark-tailored suit. Behind him walked 10 members of the Croft Coven. They did not carry swords or iron stakes. They carried folding aluminum lawn chairs. 2 of them dragged heavy red plastic coolers behind them. Saurin reached a small, elevated ridge that overlooked the boundary line. He gestured with his hand. His vampires unfolded the lawn chairs and set them in a neat row in the dirt. They sat down, crossing their legs. One of the vampires popped open a cooler and handed Saurin a bottle of sparkling water. Fallon stared in disbelief. Her jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me?" Fallon yelled, pointing her bat at the ridge. "They brought seating? They brought beverages?" Saurin unscrewed the cap of his water bottle. He took a sip and offered a cheerful wave down to the wolves. "Do not mind us," Saurin called out, his smooth voice carrying over the clearing. "We are just here for moral support and to make sure nobody scratches my new shoes in the mud. Give them hell, Alpha!" Fallon let out a loud, frustrated groan. "They brought popcorn to a bloodbath. I hate vampires. I hate all of them." Callahan ground his teeth together. The muscles in his neck strained. He turned his attention back to the dark forest path. The enemy lines were mere yards away. Chapter 20. The rogue vampires fanned out across the boundary line. They formed a jagged, uneven wall of pale faces and bared fangs. They hissed at the assembled wolves, their eyes locked on the muscular throats of the Adler warriors. The rogue leader stepped to the front of the pack. He looked worse than he did in the warehouse. A layer of red brick dust still clung to his greasy blonde hair, and his scarred jaw twitched with nervous energy. He gripped the rusted iron pipe in both hands, tapping it against his thigh. The 2 armies stood 10 paces apart. The cold wind died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the clearing. Up on the ridge, the Croft Coven sat in their aluminum chairs, watching the showdown with quiet amusement. Callahan stepped forward, leaving the ranks of his wolves. He stood in the no-man's land between the 2 forces. His broad chest heaved. The golden stare of his eyes locked onto the rogue leader. "You thought you could run, Adler!" the rogue leader shouted. He threw his arms out wide, playing to his audience of killers. "You thought a few fireworks and a broken wall would stop us. We are immortal. We do not stop. Tonight, we take the geothermal basin. We take your land." Callahan did not say a word. He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet air. The rogue leader took a step closer, pointing the iron pipe at Callahan's chest. "You are looking at the new king of this territory. I have the blood of ancient masters in my veins. My destiny is written in the stars, and your pack is nothing but a stepping stone to my complete dominance." Callahan did not wait for the end of the speech. The Alpha closed the distance in 2 huge strides. He planted his left boot in the dirt, twisted his hips, and drove his right fist straight into the center of the rogue leader's face. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a block of ice. The rogue leader's nose shattered. Yellowed fangs flew from his mouth, spiraling into the dark grass. The force of the blow lifted the vampire off his feet and sent him crashing flat onto his back. He hit the ground hard, his iron pipe clattering away into the darkness. From her spot in the front line, Fallon pumped her fist in the air. "Right in the teeth!" Fallon cheered at the top of her lungs, waving her ashwood bat. "That is what I am talking about! End his monologue!" The punch broke the tension. The battlefield erupted. With a unified shriek, the rogues charged forward. The Adler wolves roared in response, surging ahead to meet the enemy. The two lines crashed together in a chaotic tangle of fists, weapons, and blood. Callahan stayed in his human form. He did not need claws to break bones. A rogue lunged at his back, aiming a jagged hunting knife at his spine. Callahan spun on his heel, caught the vampire's wrist, and twisted hard. The joint snapped with a loud crack. The rogue screamed, dropping the knife. Callahan followed up with a brutal knee to the chest, caving in the vampire's ribs and sending him flying into the brush. "Tear them apart," his inner wolf howled, drunk on the violence. 10 yards away, Fallon fought her own battle. She ducked under a wild swing from a rogue's chain. She stepped inside his guard, drove the end of her ashwood bat into his stomach, and followed with a sweeping strike to his knee. The joint gave way. The vampire dropped. Fallon spun her black-forged steel karambit, slashing the curved blade across the rogue's shoulder to keep him down. A second rogue tried to flank the Alpha. Fallon intercepted, swinging her bat like a baseball player. The heavy wood cracked against the vampire's skull, sending him spinning into the dirt. Callahan glanced over his shoulder, his chest heaving. He offered a single nod of approval. Fallon offered a tired salute with the karambit before turning back to the brawl. The clearing turned into a blur of brutal hand-to-hand combat. The sound of breaking wood, clashing steel, and pained grunts filled the night air. Callahan moved through the chaos like a wrecking ball, clearing a path through the enemy lines. Up on the ridge, Saurin watched the carnage. He took another sip of his sparkling water, unbothered by the violence unfolding below. Down in the mud, the Adler pack fought for their home. Chapter 21. The boundary line erupted into a storm of violence. The clash of iron pipes against ashwood spears rang through the cold night air. The dirt clearing, bathed in the pale light of the full moon, turned into a chaotic meat grinder. 50 Adler wolves pushed against the swarm of rogue vampires. Blood sprayed across the trampled grass, dark and slick under the moonlight. Fallon stood her ground on the left flank. A rogue with a rusted bike chain swung the heavy metal toward her head. She ducked, feeling the wind of the weapon ruffle her hair. She stepped inside his guard, gripping her solid ashwood bat with both hands, and drove the blunt end straight into his stomach. The vampire doubled over with a breathless wheeze. Fallon did not hesitate. She spun the black-forged steel karambit in her right hand and dragged the curved blade across his thigh. The rogue collapsed into the mud, clutching his ruined leg. "Next!" Fallon yelled over the din of the battle. She kicked the fallen vampire away and raised her bat. 10 yards away, Callahan fought like a force of nature. He remained in his human form, his muscular torso slick with sweat and the blood of his enemies. 3 rogues circled him. The first lunged with a jagged hunting knife. Callahan caught the attacker's wrist, twisted the arm until the bones snapped, and hurled the man into the second rogue. They went down in a tangle of limbs. The third rogue swung a lead pipe. Callahan stepped inside the arc of the weapon, grabbed the vampire by the throat, and slammed him face first into the dirt. Up on the elevated ridge, Saurin crossed his legs in his aluminum lawn chair. He held his bottle of sparkling water, watching the carnage with total indifference. "Watch your footwork, Adler," Saurin called out, his smooth voice carrying over the screams of the battlefield. "You left your left side exposed. You fight like a drunken dock worker." Fallon parried a knife thrust from a new attacker. She shoved the rogue back and turned her head toward the ridge. "Shut up and throw me a water bottle," Fallon shouted back, panting hard. "My throat is dry." Saurin chuckled, taking a refined sip of his drink. In the center of the clearing, the rogue leader pushed himself up from the ground. His face was a ruined mess of bruised purple flesh. Callahan's initial punch had flattened his nose and shattered his front teeth. The blonde vampire spit a mouthful of dark blood and broken fangs into the dirt. His eyes burned with unhinged fury. He realized he could not beat the Adler Alpha in a fistfight. The werewolf possessed too much raw power. The rogue leader scanned the chaotic battlefield, looking for an advantage. His gaze locked onto the silver-haired woman fighting on the left flank. He watched Callahan throw a rogue to the ground, then snap his head around to check her position. The Alpha cared about the stray. That was the weak point. The rogue leader reached inside his cheap leather jacket. He bypassed his rusted iron pipe and wrapped his fingers around his hidden weapon. He pulled out a foot-long, jagged iron railroad spike. The metal was dark, heavy, and lethal. He locked his eyes on Fallon. He pulled his arm back, his muscles coiling tight, and hurled the heavy iron spike through the air like a javelin. The metal projectile spun through the cold wind, aimed right at the center of Fallon's back. Callahan heard the sharp whistle of the iron cutting through the air. The wolf's vision tracked the movement. "Mate!" his inner wolf roared, a sound of pure, blinding terror echoing in his skull. Callahan abandoned his fight. He shoved a rogue out of his way and launched his entire body across the dirt clearing. He pushed his muscles past their limits, moving faster than a human ever could. He threw his broad frame between Fallon and the flying metal. The impact sounded like a butcher slamming a meat cleaver into a wooden block. The foot-long iron spike sank deep into Callahan's left side, tearing through the skin and lodging between his ribs. The sheer force of the throw stopped his forward momentum. The iron burned his flesh, poisoning his system the second it made contact. Callahan let out a guttural, choked gasp. His knees buckled. He crashed down into the wet mud, his blood spilling dark and fast across the trampled grass. The battle around him faded into a dull, echoing blur as the cold bite of the iron dragged him toward the dark. Chapter 22. The heavy thud of Callahan hitting the dirt echoed in Fallon's ears. She spun around, her boots sliding in the mud. The sight of the Alpha lying in the trampled grass brought the world to a grinding halt. The jagged iron spike protruded from his ribs. Dark crimson stained his soaked denim jeans and pooled on the wet earth beneath him. His eyes fluttered, fighting a losing battle against the pain and the poison of the metal. A cold shockwave ripped through Fallon's chest. The fear vanished, replaced by a white-hot, explosive fury that burned every nerve in her body. "Nobody touches my Alpha!" Fallon screamed at the top of her lungs. Her voice cracked, raw and wild. She dropped the ashwood bat. She let the black-forged steel karambit fall into the mud. She threw her head back, and the transformation overtook her in a violent rush. Her bones cracked and reformed in the blink of an eye. The shredded strips of her wet shirt snapped. Her denim jeans tore apart, the thick fabric ripping into useless threads as her body expanded. The human woman disappeared, replaced by the sleek, terrifying form of a silver wolf. The wolf hit the ground on all four paws. She bared a set of razor-sharp teeth, letting out a snarl that shook the pine branches at the edge of the clearing. 10 yards away, the rogue leader watched her shift. He reached down and scooped up his rusted iron pipe from the grass, a frantic panic washing over his ruined face. He backed away, raising the weapon. The silver wolf did not hesitate. She dug her claws into the dirt and launched herself forward like a fired bullet. The rogue leader swung the iron pipe toward her skull. The wolf ducked the clumsy strike. She lunged, clamping her powerful jaws around the vampire's wrist. She ripped her head to the side. The bones snapped with a sickening crunch. The rogue shrieked, dropping the iron pipe to the ground. Before the vampire could pull away, the silver wolf hit his chest with her full weight. She tackled him to the dirt, pinning his shoulders to the mud. The rogue thrashed, striking her ribs with his good hand, but the wolf ignored the blows. She buried her face in his neck and clamped her jaws around his throat. She bit down hard. The flesh gave way. The fight ended in an instant. The rogue leader went limp, his unhinged eyes staring blank up at the cold moon. The remaining vampires witnessed their leader fall. The sight broke their courage. The rogues turned their backs on the Adler pack and sprinted for the dark safety of the old-growth forest, abandoning the war for the geothermal basin. A chorus of victorious howls rose from the Adler warriors as they chased the stragglers into the trees. The silver wolf stood over the dead rogue. Her chest heaved. She turned her head toward the spot where Callahan lay in the mud. She shifted back. Her silver fur melted away, leaving her in her human form. The cold night wind bit at her bare skin. She reached down, grabbed the collar of the dead man's outerwear, and stripped it off his corpse. She pulled the oversized garment around her shoulders, wrapping the heavy material tight to cover herself. Fallon wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing a streak of dirt across her cheek. She spit a mouthful of dark, foul-tasting liquid onto the grass. "Ugh," Fallon groaned out loud, her voice raspy from the screaming. "Tastes like pennies and bad life choices. I need a toothbrush." She pulled the leather jacket tighter against the chill and ran across the battlefield. She dropped to her knees in the wet dirt beside Callahan. The Alpha lay on his side. His breathing sounded shallow and wet. His thick hands gripped the shaft of the iron spike, but his fingers lacked the strength to pull the heavy metal free from his ribs. "Do not move," Fallon ordered, her hands hovering over the wound. She looked up, scanning the clearing for the cowardly pack elders. "Thomas, get a healer over here right now!" She pressed her hands over his, adding her strength to his grip, determined to keep him anchored to the living world. Chapter 23. The chaotic sounds of war faded into the deep woods as the Adler wolves chased down the last fleeing rogues. The boundary clearing fell quiet, save for the wind rustling the pine trees and the ragged, shallow breaths coming from the Alpha's chest. Fallon knelt in the mud, the freezing earth biting into her bare, exposed knees. She pressed her hands tight against Callahan's ribs, right next to the jagged iron spike. Dark blood coated her fingers. The metal burned his skin on contact, poisoning his accelerated healing factor and leaving him helpless in the dirt. Callahan kept his eyes open, his heavy stare locked onto her face. "You stayed," Callahan rasped, his voice a broken rumble. "Shut up and save your strength," Fallon snapped. A frantic edge bled into her tone. "I am not digging a grave tonight. It is too cold and I do not own a shovel." Up on the elevated ridge, the Croft coven began to pack up their camp. The vampires folded their seating with crisp, coordinated snaps. They gathered their drink containers and smoothed the wrinkles from their suits. Saurin stood at the edge of the hill. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine dark jacket. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of white paper. He walked down the slope, taking slow, deliberate steps to avoid the worst of the mud puddles. He navigated the battlefield like a man taking a casual stroll through a park, stepping over the broken bodies of the rogue vampires without a second glance. Saurin reached the center of the clearing and stopped right in front of Fallon. He looked down at the Alpha bleeding out in the grass. "A dramatic finish," Saurin noted. He held out the crisp white paper. "I do love a good sacrifice. It adds a certain flair to the evening. However, business is business." Fallon stared at the vampire lord in disbelief. "He has iron in his chest. Read the room." "I am reading my ledger," Saurin countered. He shook the paper. "Take it." Fallon took one hand off Callahan's side, snatched the paper from Saurin, and pressed her hand back over the wound. She glared at the document. It was an itemized bill, printed in neat black ink. "Solid steel replacement crypt door, complete with installation fees," Saurin recited from memory, tapping his chin. "One imported Italian espresso machine, international shipping and handling for the machine, and, of course, a flat hazard pay rate for my coven's time spent supervising this messy little turf war." Saurin offered a polite smile. "Direct cash value. Bank transfers are acceptable. I do not offer supernatural discounts." Fallon read the total number at the bottom of the page. She let out a long, low whistle. "You are broke now, Alpha," Fallon announced to the bleeding man. She shoved the paper into the pocket of the oversized leather jacket. "You are going to be eating bad deer meat on Tuesdays for the rest of your life to pay this off." Callahan let out a sound that sat somewhere between a grunt of pain and a laugh. The movement pulled at his ribs, causing him to wince. Elders Thomas, Henry, and Arthur finally broke from the safety of the tree line. They ran across the clearing, accompanied by 2 strong pack warriors carrying a makeshift stretcher crafted from pine poles and heavy canvas. The old men looked terrified, covered in sweat despite avoiding the battle. "Alpha!" Thomas cried out, dropping to his knees on the opposite side of Callahan. He looked at the iron spike and paled. "We must get him to the infirmary now. The healers are waiting." The 2 warriors set the stretcher in the mud. They grabbed Callahan by his broad shoulders and his belt, lifting his heavy frame onto the canvas. He ground his teeth together, refusing to scream as the iron shifted in his chest. "Move out!" Henry yelled, waving his hands. The warriors lifted the stretcher and began the fast trek back toward the Adler Pack grounds. Fallon stood up. She wiped her bloody hands on the front of the stolen jacket. Saurin offered a polite tip of his head before turning back toward the graveyard, his coven trailing behind him in the dark. Fallon did not look back. She fell into step right beside the stretcher, keeping her eyes locked on Callahan as they marched toward the pack house. Chapter 24. The Adler Pack infirmary smelled of crushed herbs, sterile alcohol, and the metallic tang of old blood. Fallon sat on a hard wooden stool in the corner of the small, white-walled room. She kept the oversized leather jacket pulled tight around her frame. Her bare feet dangled an inch above the floorboards, still stained with the dark mud of the boundary line. She watched the healers work. They had spent 3 hours hunched over Callahan's broad torso. They used heavy iron tongs to pull the railroad spike from his ribs. The sound of the metal scraping against bone had made Fallon's stomach turn. Now, the Alpha lay under a thick wool blanket. His chest rose and fell in a slow, pained rhythm. Elder Thomas stood by the door, his face pale in the harsh lamplight. "The iron poison sits deep," the old man whispered. "His healing is slow. He might not wake for days." "He'll wake up," Fallon snapped. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "He's too stubborn to die. He still owes me an apology for dragging me to a graveyard." Thomas sighed, shook his head, and slipped out of the room. Fallon stayed. She didn't move for 3 days. She drank bitter tea brought by the cooks and ate a plate of cold, stringy venison. "Worst meat in the territory," she thought, pushing the plate away. She stared at the Alpha's face, watching the color return to his skin. On the 3rd night, the storm outside returned. Rain lashed against the infirmary windows. The wind howled, rattling the glass in its frames. Callahan's hand twitched on top of the blanket. A low, guttural groan vibrated in his chest. His eyes flickered open. The amber glow looked dim, clouded by the remnants of the poison, but his gaze locked onto Fallon immediately. "You look terrible," Callahan rasped. His voice was a broken scrape of sound. Fallon let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A sharp, stinging relief flooded her chest, but she smothered it with a scowl. She stood up from the stool, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. "Romance is dead," Fallon muttered. She walked to the side of the bed and looked down at him. "Go back to sleep, Alpha. Your brain is clearly still scrambled." Callahan reached out with a heavy hand. He grabbed the hem of the stolen leather jacket, his fingers weak but determined. "The rogue," he managed to say. "The spike." "I took care of it," Fallon said. She reached into the jacket pocket and pulled out the crisp white paper Saurin had delivered on the battlefield. She shook the invoice in front of his face. "But we have bigger problems. You're broke. Saurin wants a new steel door and an espresso machine. I hope you have a savings account." Callahan stared at the bill. A sound that sat somewhere between a cough and a laugh shook his chest. He winced, his hand flying to his bandaged ribs. He'll get his machine, Callahan whispered. He looked up at her, his stare turning intense. The wolf inside his skull, quiet for days, let out a low, content purr. Mate, she stayed. Why didn't you run? Callahan asked. The fight was over. You had the chance to disappear into the woods while the pack was distracted. Fallon looked at the rain hitting the window. She thought about the fake bite mark, the red pen ink, and her desperate plan to leave. Then she thought about Callahan diving in front of a jagged iron spike to save her back. I hate hiking in the rain, Fallon said, her voice dropping to a soft hum. And I realized I'd miss the drama. This pack is a mess, but at least it isn't boring. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. A real smile, small and fleeting, broke across her face. Callahan closed his eyes, his grip on her jacket loosening as he drifted back into a natural, healing sleep. Chapter 25. The sun rose bright and clear over the Adler territory. The smell of wet pine and wood smoke filled the air as the pack gathered in the central courtyard. The tension of the war had vanished, replaced by a sense of grim victory. Pack members worked together to scrub the mud from the communal porches and repair the broken fences. Fallon stood on the front steps of the pack house. She wore a clean pair of jeans from her own cabin and a thick, oversized wool sweater borrowed from the infirmary stores. She was still barefoot, her toes curling against the sun-warmed wood of the porch. The heavy oak doors behind her swung open. Callahan stepped out into the light. He was bare-chested again, a thick white bandage wrapped tight around his middle. He walked with a slight limp, but his head was held high. The lethal spark had returned to his eyes. The three elders stood in the courtyard. They looked up at their alpha, their expressions filled with a new kind of respect. Even the pack warriors stopped their work to watch. Callahan looked at the crowd, then he looked at Fallon. "The lie is over," Callahan announced. His voice boomed across the clearing, steady and unshakable. He turned toward Fallon. He didn't ask permission. He stepped close, his heat washing over her like a physical wave. He reached out, his thick hand cupping the back of her neck. His thumb brushed over the spot where the red pen ink had long since washed away. "No more fake marks," Callahan rumbled. He leaned down. Fallon didn't pull away. She tilted her head, exposing the line of her throat. Callahan bit down. The sting lasted only a second. It was followed by a rush of heat that felt like molten gold pouring through her veins. A tether snapped into place, a deep, soul-level connection that tied her spirit to the man standing before her. The heavy weight of the pack, the borders, and the duty didn't feel like a rope anymore. It felt like an anchor. Fallon gasped, her hands clutching his bare shoulders as the bond settled. Callahan pulled back. A small, dark mark sat on her skin, a true alpha's claim. He looked at the elders and the warriors. "This is your Luna," Callahan declared. "She fought for the pack. She bled for the pack. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The courtyard erupted in a roar of approval. The wolves shifted their feet, a unified sound of loyalty. Fallon rubbed the new mark on her neck. She looked up at Callahan, a spark of her usual sass returning to her eyes. "Does this mean I get a say in the Tuesday menu?" she asked, her voice loud enough for the elders to hear. "Because that venison is a crime against nature." Callahan let out a booming laugh, his first real one in years. He wrapped a heavy arm around her shoulders and pulled her close to his side. "We'll talk to the cooks," he promised. The celebration was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic tapping at the main gate. One of Saurin's vampire thralls, dressed in a delivery uniform, stepped out of a black car. He carried a large cardboard box with Italian writing on the side. He walked up to the porch, looking confused by the bare-chested giant and the barefoot woman. "Delivery for Saurin?" the man asked. Fallon reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card that had arrived with the box. She read it out loud. "It's from the vampire," Fallon said, a smirk dancing on her lips. "He says the espresso machine is beautiful, but you still owe him for the ribbon he used to wrap the broken coffin pieces. He says he'll see us at the solstice." Callahan groaned, leaning his head against hers. "I'm going to be paying that man back for 100 years. "Probably," Fallon agreed. She leaned into his strength, watching the sun climb higher over their home. "But look on the bright side. At least the coffee will be good." The Alpha and his Luna turned back toward the pack house, leaving the war and the lies behind them. The end. Quick favor, don't go anywhere yet. If you thought Fallon had serious nerve faking a vampire claim right to her Alpha's face, wait until you meet the heroine in this next story on your screen. You have to hear the disaster unfold. Click the video on your screen right now. It is pure chaos.